lahat sa ating lahat. Sana safe kayo kasi papasok na yung bagyo, di ba? Oo, tsaka umuulan lagi sa gabi, sa araw, etc. So kailangan tayong mag-ingat ng todo-todo para hindi magkasakit. Ayun, tuloy-tuloy pa rin po yung programa namin sa Philippine Press Institute and we're looking at the last stretch of the year kasi magbe-bear na, Joyce, di ba?
Oo.
So,
ang dami ng Jose Marichan memes. Si Prof. Ipe, guilty dyan.
Oo, guilty.
Naka-post na kanina. Sinare ko tuloy sa PPI
Pinopya ko lang yan doon
Secretariat.
sa, pinopya ko lang yan sa kambal ko, si Xiao Chua.
Biktima din ako.
Diba? Isn't it fun?
Kumanta ka ba, Prof. Ipe?
Pag tinitingnan natin yung, syempre yung Facebook natin, ang dami na nagpo-post naman kung ano-ano. Kasi parating yung merry months, no? Plural talaga kasi longest Christmas. But then again, we're inviting everyone to look at our pages kasi doon po namin pinupost all the announcements about our programs and PPI up until December. Ay, wala na pala, November na lang. November, which is yung last namin program is about the Ampatuan Massacre. But today, this is the day after January, February, March, April, May, June, July, 7 months of talking about it in our scholastic press outreach programs na ang topic natin about media conditions, challenges, etc., doing journalism, the time of the pandemic. Ayun na, ipipresent sa atin ng UST, particularly Professors Felipe Salvosa and Christian Esguerra, yung final study natin, Joyce. Siyempre excited yung lahat kasi, di ba, pinag-uusapan lagi natin, ano ba yung pinaka buo, no, na research na ginawa nila. So ayun, good afternoon everyone at sa mga nanonood sa atin, please do engage with us. Meron po tayong interactive po tayo. You can throw in your questions as well. And those inside the meeting room or the Zoom room, also, you can participate during the open forum at this point. I'd like to call the Vice President of PPI, also Editor-in-Chief of Mindanao Times, and also Trustee for Mindanao. She's wearing daming hats ni Miss Amalia Cabusao. Hi, Ami. Good afternoon to you. Asan si Ami? Ami.
Baka nagkaka-problem si Ami sa kanyang
Connection ba?
connection.
Okay. Sige, baka pumasok on and off yata si Ami. Paki-check na lang care later. Oo, si Ami.
Sir.
Ayun.
We have almost 170 participants right now in our Zoom room.
While waiting for Ami, I'd like to call the representative of Seidel Foundation on behalf of its resident representative to the Philippines. Please welcome Program Coordinator Caroline Lee. Good afternoon, Carol. Mute.
Carol, pa-unmute. Sorry.
Thank you. Nalimutan na eh. Parang akala ko in person na. Okay. Good. Thank you, Ariel. Good afternoon to you and Joyce, of course, to Professor Felipe Salvosa, Professor Christian Esguerra, and si Madam Amalia Cabusao. We're waiting for her to come online, no? And of course, to our esteemed lineup of reactors. I'll leave it to Ariel and Joyce to give the proper introductions. So thank you all for being here, for making time for this online activity. 179 na, Joyce, in the Zoom room. Grabe, ang bilis niyang tumaas yung number kanina. When I logged in, it was like 30 plus, naging 50 plus. So it's spiking. This is one good spike, no? So today we're here for sabi nga ni Ariel, long-awaited presentation of the results ng research. And the Seidel Foundation, of course, is excited to be able to support this research. And as we know, research is very important. It helps to build knowledge. It facilitates learning. And of course, it is one of the ways by which issues can be better understood No? And then in this case, the issue relates to our journalists and of course helps to increase public awareness. Now, the Seidel Foundation and the Philippine Press Institute are partners for the project on civic journalism. So we're really glad to be able to support this. And together, there has been quite a number of activities supported since we started the partnership, and especially for the last few years, there have been seminars, media seminars, roundtable discussions, and other regular activities like the chronicles, and of course, newly started this year, the podcast, amongst others. Now, just a few words about the Seidel Foundation. Our resident representative, Mr. Gatsainike, he would have wanted to be with us today, but he sends his regards. The foundation has been working on development cooperation projects here in the Philippines with local partners since 1979. And we work through local organizations such as the Philippine Press Institute, who knows the Philippine situation better, and to get the local projects implemented. So back to today's activity, which is a research on reporting in the new normal, Filipino journalistic practices in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I understand this study is being undertaken under a global journalism research network, which is called the Global Risk Journalism Hub. And it was started June 2021. Is that correct, Professor Ipe? And we happen to be supporting the second phase, or the qualitative track, so to speak, during which journalists were interviewed for the research. So mainly, this is to find out actually how has the pandemic affected the way the journalists gather information, gather the news and data, and how this also has affected the news organizations. I should end there because I'm sure we're all excited to listen to the results more than what I have to say. So let's hand the virtual floor back to Ariel, and I wish everyone a very informative discussion and presentation this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Seidel Foundation. Regards to Attorney Gatsainike, I hope to see him in person, probably in the next few days for our other activities. But as I said, this is actually the last leg of the Scholastic Press Outreach Program of the Philippine Press Institute. And what a way to end it with the presentation and with full research. So joining me today is Seminar Director Joyce Pañares. Both of us are going to moderate and host this presentation program. My name is Ariel Sisibalina. I'm the Executive Director and Trustee of the Philippine Press Institute. I give the virtual floor to Joyce right now. Hi, Joyce.
Hi, Ariel. Good afternoon. Good afternoon to all our participants today, yung ating audience. Ang dami po natin sa loob ng Zoom room at naka-live din po tayo sa Facebook pages po ng PPI and I think ng HSF as well. So ayun, we're all very excited. Kaya madami po yung nag-attend today because these are also the students and the faculty members who attended most of our scholastic programs the past 7 months.
7 months,
so,
correct.
Excited din po sila na malaman ano ba yung naging conclusion ng ating research. And let's not delay this further. I'd like to call Professor Felipe Salvosa II to introduce the topic or introduce the research. Hi, Prof. Ipe.
Hello, good afternoon, Joyce. Thank you for introducing the team of researchers and to Ariel as well. I would like to extend my gratitude to the Philippine Press Institute, for hosting our presentation of our key findings. Also, I would like to thank the Hans Seidel Foundation for supporting research undertakings such as this. No, I fully agree with Carol. The research gives us important insights um, into how the world of journalism works. No, and the pandemic is the pandemic is a rich source, of scholarship. No? And we hope that this humble undertaking of ours will contribute to the growing body of research on how the pandemic has impacted our lives. My colleague, Christian Esguerra, is going to share our slides. I hope he can be given sharing privileges. Okay. So today's presentation is titled "Working in the New Normal." Essentially is an undertaking that seeks to find out how the COVID-19 pandemic affected journalistic practice in the Philippines. So we're doing this as faculty members of the University of Santo Tomas and researchers under a research center called the Research Center for Culture, Arts, and the Humanities in UST. And this is the Philippine results. These are the Philippine results. And Carol is correct in saying that we are part of a bigger international network of journalism educators and researchers and practitioners looking at it. So these are the Philippine results of the qualitative track of the study. So you could expect more publications to start coming out towards the end of the year, discussing the results, the global results, including the Philippine results. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so our research question is this. So how did the COVID-19 pandemic affect news gathering practices and editorial approaches of Filipino journalism? So that's the main question that we wanted to investigate. Next slide. Okay, of course, we needed to look at the on research, on how journalism adapted, in previous pandemic situations. But we found that research on journalism and health emergencies, they were mostly focused on the framing of news coverage. And more often than not, the results were unflattering to the news media, international news media. For example, examining the coverage of swine flu in the US in 2007, in their study published in 2007, and also in 2016, another study that looked into the science reporting of disease and death, the findings indicated that news coverage has been sensational, sensational and market-driven. Okay. Next slide. Okay. In 2018, another group of researchers, looking at the coverage of the AH1N1 outbreak in Europe, made this conclusion, that news coverage of both, quality and tabloid newspapers amplified the risks of the disease, and they preferred drama and emotion. Okay, in a study of the print news coverage of the 1918 pandemic, so throwback naman to sa Spanish flu pandemic, a 2001 study, of the 1918 flu pandemic coverage found that journalists depended on experts and factual or empirical data. Okay, they propped up the status of scientific and government authorities and took average citizens for granted. Okay, next slide. Now, studies involving interviews with journalists and editors provided more insights into journalistic practices during pandemics. No? So, for example, a study published in 2019 covering journalists in Germany and Finland showed that journalists shifted their roles towards becoming public health mobilizers. And they were more of cooperative agents rather than watchdogs. Next slide. A 2012 study, which involved interviews of 16 journalists in Australia in 2006 and 2007, found that practitioners, mindful of the impact of their work on the public, saw themselves as informants who must report the news accurately. And moreover, journalists expressed willingness to continue doing their jobs despite the avian influenza pandemic and placed emphasis on independent news coverage. However, other aspects of news coverage need to be explored, and we need to look into how journalism fared this time, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, our methodology, as mentioned by Ms. Carol earlier, is qualitative. So qualitative meaning we did in-depth interviews of 30 journalists. And in doing so, we were required by the Social Science Ethics Research Board to secure their informed consent. And then these in-depth interviews were then transcribed and processed, and then we proceeded to do a thematic analysis. Okay, next slide. So this is the profile of our interviewees. According to platform, we interviewed 3 journalists working in the TV and radio, 16 journalists working in both the print and online media, 8 journalists who were working for online platforms, 1 freelancer, one journalist from a wire agency, and lastly, a journalist from a non-profit news organization. Next slide. Next, we also had, this is the profile of interviewees based on coverage or scope. We had 19 journalists from national news organizations and 11 journalists from regional or local or community news organizations. Next slide. Okay, I think I mentioned this in previous PPI Scholastic forums. So thematic analysis is a method of identifying, analyzing, and reporting patterns within the data. So in this method, it's very time consuming, very labor intensive, because it required, of course, transcription, reading and reading of transcripts, categorizing data into groups, developing broader themes relevant to the research topic, back and forth on the review of the themes, and then the write-up and the narrative. Next slide. So in the qualitative method, so we shouldn't expect to see percentages or statistical certainty. So again, this is not a quantitative research, this is qualitative. So qualitative research is meant to how you call this, it's meant to complement quantitative research. It will not provide statistical representation, but it will be able to provide more in-depth views on the experiences, the lived experiences of journalists as they navigated the new landscape during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, our analysis general use the social responsibility framework. social responsibility simply tells us that news organizations have moral obligations to society, no? And in the social responsibility theory, news organizations, journalists have six functions, no, to provide information and discussion and debate, no, and the public, safeguard individual rights, provide a medium for buyers and sellers to meet, no, what we know as advertising, providing entertainment and maintaining financial self-sufficiency, no. So this acquires a health and a risk dimension as applied to the coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. Okay, so I would like to turn over now the virtual floor to my colleague, Assistant Professor Christian Esguerra, to start the discussion on the key findings. Christian.
Okay, thank you, Professor Salvosa. So for this part, we'll talk about the key findings already. So I think this is the more exciting part, and this could spur more interesting discussions later on. So first, we looked into the journalists' views, key issues according to them that were confronting the Philippines during the COVID-19 crisis. We also looked at the reporting methods as affected by the pandemic restrictions, and then there are also findings when it comes to personal and professional challenges encountered by journalists. And of course, lastly, the role perception of journalists as affected by the experience in covering the COVID-19 pandemic. So first, for the key issues confronting the Philippines during the COVID-19 crisis, there were three themes that were identified. First, according to the journalists interviewed, there was unpreparedness, quite predictably and understandably, on the part of the government mainly, in terms of dealing with the pandemic, especially early on. And of course, the second was a problem of both misinformation and disinformation, as we saw especially during the discussions or coverage of the inoculation drives or the vaccines, even before they became available. There were discussions as to how effective vaccines would actually be. And some thought that it was a given that Filipinos would actually accept vaccines against COVID-19. But as we found out based on our coverage, there were problems in certain communities in the Philippines where there was initial reluctance to be vaccinated. And the third theme was the corruption issues, especially during the Pharmalic controversy. So in particular, number one, the biggest issue confronting the Philippines early on, according to the respondents, was the unpreparedness as shown by inconsistent and unclear, as well as shifting policy pronouncements, including those pertaining to lockdowns and other restrictions. So there were discussions as to whether a government like the Philippines could actually be really prepared in terms of dealing with the pandemic. But of course, there were comparisons later on with other countries as to how they were responding early on during the pandemic. Understandably, there was no guidebook in terms of dealing with this kind of pandemic in this particular time. But there were concerns regarding the unpreparedness of the government. And we saw this when it came to, for example, lockdown itself early on. There were discussions as to whether lockdown was a proper term to be used or whether community quarantine was the proper term. And I think President Duterte himself early on was the one who made use of this lockdown as a term, when in fact his people in Malacanang were trying to clarify it. The first time that this was declared in March, on March 15, 2020, the Luzon-wide lockdown. Here, they also had to work harder. I mean, the journalists who were interviewed, they had to work harder to try to make sense of information coming from key government officials, including or especially the president. Now, in terms of misinformation and disinformation, respondents pointed to the problem of misinformation and disinformation as seen in the vaccine hesitancy of many Filipinos soon after the government announced that inoculations were now being planned. Now, much of the reporting had to focus on the importance of being vaccinated and how and why vaccines work. Then here, I'd like to quote one veteran journalist working in a multi-platform journalist. Sabi niya, for me, yung media is part of the confusion kasi nga nung una, kung kukuha ka ng reliable information, kukuha ka sa DOH, syempre. Kung mali na yung impormasyon from the DOH, magiging mali yung ipapasa mo sa tao. So later, itatahi natin to dun sa ibang mga findings that we saw in the research. Concern din, for example, yung sourcing. And still, misinformation and disinformation, nakalagay dito, sabi ng isa sa mga na-interview namin, announcements like these create confusion. And sometimes they make it seem as if kami, yung media pa yung nagkakamali sa reporting. I think nakaka-contribute din yun sa accusations na inaccurate na information yung inilalabas kahit yung source of confusion naman talaga is from the officials. Now, this was according to an online journalist in her 20s. And then the third issue confronting the Philippines as identified by the respondents, yung they cited the questionable multi-million peso procurement by the Department of Health through the Department of Budget's Procurement Service or PSDBM of supplies for medical frontliners. It was tough for them seeing huge government resources allegedly being wasted, while many Filipinos, at least at that time, were struggling even with basic supplies such as face masks and face shields. Ayun. Here, I'd like to turn over the floor to Professor Salvosa to talk about how misinformation and disinformation affected newsrooms and journalistic practice.
Okay, so Christian later will return to discuss the remainder of the findings after my turn. So, of course, we ended up also discussing what for them was the impact of misinformation and disinformation. And we saw a pattern of newsrooms allocating more resources, and that includes manpower and also time, to handling or dealing with misinformation and disinformation. And of course, this has led to an additional workload on the part of journalists. So, paulit-ulit to in many of the journalists we interviewed, that they felt compelled to answer or clarify misinformation, and because of this, they needed to do more work. For instance, this is what an editor of a news website told us. We also had to dedicate time and resources into fact-checking during the pandemic, and we were already fact-checking before, but those fact-checking efforts were mostly political statements. Okay. Now, an editor of a community newspaper also said that right off the bat, we were fighting disinformation left and right. Another community journalist told us that for him, it's been very tiring to dispute disinformation and misinformation. Next slide. Okay, moving on to another set of key findings. We found following our interviews that journalists develop reporting routines or methods during the pandemic. Of course, you would say many of us here who work in newsrooms would say, we've been doing this, but I would say that journalists covering the COVID pandemic, were able to develop or rediscover these old routines, as a result of the lockdown or pandemic restrictions, or even if kumbaga, we're giving a name, to these practices, with the objective of making them more understandable, and to be able to pass this on, to future practitioners of journalism. Ang isa namin nakita is the development of verification dashboards, dashboards. Saan ka magpupunta if you need to verify a piece of information? Okay? So for example, maybe social media could be one dashboard on its own, and there are tools to monitor social media. Uh, of course, another set of dashboards would be international war agencies, no, which are considered very reliable sources of information, international news agencies, no, and then websites of established health-related institutions, and that includes the WHO and yung Johns Hopkins University. Okay. Okay. So for instance, according to one journalist, sabi niya, ako po personally, I tried to access the database of Johns Hopkins para lang ma-compare the number of cases of the Philippines, not just the number of deaths and active cases. No? So they used the Johns Hopkins to compare Philippine statistics with those of other Asian countries. No? So a news website, an editor of a news website also told us that they maintained one set of dashboards for social media, no, another set of dashboards pertaining to websites that contain COVID information, no, and preferably a third party that's considered reliable, no. And they also counter-checked with war agencies, no, and other sources of news. Okay, we also found that journalists conducted vertical or horizontal verification. Ano? So journalists found it imperative to check official pronouncements against official or field data and validate further using international data. Okay. So for instance, according to a TV journalist, no, whom we interviewed, female TV journalist, no, who's had extensive experience in foreign news organizations, no, and also government. She told us na even if it's official, I validate. Yung galing sa taas, sa national level, bababa ako, ganun kakulit. Pupunta talaga ako sa barangay or magtatawag ako ng barangay official. Totoo po ba ito? Ganito kasi ang narinig ko sa taas. Tapos babalik naman ako sa taas, sabi ng nasa baba, iba. Okay. And then another journalist told us, I would check again expert sources and then I'll check those expert sources against with more international sources. Next slide. Okay, Christian, would you like to add anything?
Proceed muna, din ako mamaya sa sources.
Okay, and then journalists develop virtual lines of communication. Okay, so we found that direct messaging became more common and became an acceptable substitute for face-to-face interviews. No, once they have verified the identities of these persons, no, once they have verified that these officials concerned are indeed the owners of these social media accounts or Viber accounts, no. So a community journalist told us that in the community setting or the local setting, as much as possible, they prefer the face-to-face interactions. But if it's not possible, they conducted phone calls and phone interviews. No, a Manila-based TV journalist said that it's either direct message or in-person interview. Okay, an editor of community paper told us naman that he found that the sources of information were open to do online interviews, no? So either via Facebook Messenger, via Google Meets. Okay. Next slide. Next slide, Christian.
Okay. Levels of trustworthiness.
Okay, so I'll introduce this part, and then I think Christian will add some insights on this result. So we found that journalists developed a routine on how to evaluate source credibility. Tinawag namin itong levels of trustworthiness. Okay? So they use two primary criteria. First one, this is in order. First one is the level of expertise. Second one is motivation, including political motivation. And this is balanced vis-a-vis other sources. Okay? And then we found that there's a bias toward institutional sources that have established credibility. So therefore, institutional sources still went through vetting, but minimal compared with other types of sources. No? So I think we could say that they went through stages, no, of evaluating source credibility. I think Christian can discuss this better than me. No?
Okay. In dito, we identified the three levels of trustworthiness in terms of validating or vetting data related to COVID-19. So the first level was ascribed credibility, followed by validated expertise, and then third, inclusion in pool of expert sources. Yung ascribed credibility, normally mga journalists, they looked at sino ba yung pwede magsalita with credibility about the pandemic. So naghanap ng iba't ibang mga sources, and there was initially the experience of people somehow seeing doctors as the same. Na para bang basta doktor, merong credibility to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic. So yung ascribed credibility. Then later on, there was validation of the expertise. Teka, anong klase ka ba doktor? And can you actually talk with more credibility about certain facets of the pandemic compared, let's say, with a doctor who actually specialized or even subspecialized on the matter. And then later on, dun pinapasok yung iba't ibang mga nakausap or na-identify na sources or experts in a pool of expert sources. So kaya ako napapansin nyo, merong iba't ibang mga in-interview, sometimes pare-pareho. And sometimes even journalists themselves questioned the kind of credibility of certain people who often speak about the pandemic. So ito yung levels na identified namin. So we ascribe credibility on certain sources, but we validated their expertise, and then we included them in a pool of expert sources. Ayan. In short, may K ba sila to talk about the pandemic? Ayan. O sige.
So said the TV journalist, no, ito yung kanyang method in vetting a source. No? First, you have to see the source. The source is not necessarily the authorized spokesperson, no? So sabi niya, is this source directly involved in the issue, or does this source sit in meetings? No, is he part of the team that worked on an issue? No, and then this TV journalist told us that she looked at the person's credibility. What is this person's agenda? Is this person engaged in propaganda? Does this source have his or her own interest to watch out for? No. That's the second level of analysis. No? So she tells us that these are the two main criteria that she used in vetting sources. Next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Some other quotes from our interviewees. No? So I make sure that I get information from people who are supposed to be the ones credible to speak and privy to the information that I needed. Okay. This is from an online news editor. It's really the provenance and the source of the information, where it's coming from, who's saying it, and also the history of those institutions. No? Next slide.
Yeah, tsaka if I may add dun sa levels of trustworthiness, diba kanina ko napansin niya may discussion, binanggit ng isang TV reporter, the source actually sit in meetings that he was talking about. No? So later on, yung early part of the pandemic, we got the impression journalists were trying to consume as many information as they could while validating those information with other sources. And then later on, mas naging conscious doon sa motivation noong mga nagsasalita. For example, bakit ito mukhang contradictory doon sa isa pang expert opinion despite their equal credibility? So doon tinitingnan, baka naman dahil ito is trying to do some house cleaning for the government, o kaya itong isa naman trying to unnecessarily attack the government position or policy.
Okay, ito. I think this is the last quote dito sa portion na to ng results. No? This is a quote from a print reporter who was covered the IATF. Sabi niya, if you have a source who has a history of spinning, no, then the more fact-checking or rigorous the verification process will be. But for example, we have the likes of one of the trusted officials, former FDA Chief Domingo is a very reliable person. Admittedly, mas kaunti. No, mas kaunting vetting or verification. Okay. I think Christian will take over from here.
Ito naman, the most important personal and professional challenges encountered by journalists during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we identified 3 and then we will elaborate on this shortly. First, yung longer working hours. Number 2, mental health issues or concerns. And then number 3, fear of failure. So dito sa longer working hours, the pandemic lockdowns in the Philippines, the longest in the world, took a toll on journalists who participated in the study. Many of them worked longer hours at home, often staring at blurring the lines between personal time and professional duties, which were both more or less defined prior to the pandemic. In short, bago yung pandemic, maliwanag naman kung anong personal time at saka anong professional work na ginagawa. Kahit technically, journalism was a 24-hour job. Pero during the pandemic, based on our interviews, mukhang nagkatotoo for many of the journalists. Yung talagang wala ng division between ano ba yung personal time ko at saka ano ba yung professional time. Kasi nasa bahay sila, so mas mahirap. So at the height of the pandemic, a reporter for an online news organization said she worked between 12 and 18 hours minimum because of the government briefings and former President Rodrigo Duterte's late night press conferences. And then this also affected or gave rise to certain mental health concerns. Kasi nga iba hindi na ma-identify yung difference between them as a person working at home or doing something, some household chores, being parents, being children, or being simply a relative doon sa kanilang role as a journalist. So mental health was also a significant issue among journalists as a result of longer working hours and experience covering victims of COVID-19. So working alone at home, away from colleagues, and connected only via messaging apps was also taxing for many of them. So ito, according to one photojournalist and reporter that we spoke with, sabi niya, there were times na naiiyak siya habang ginagawa yung stories niya. Kasi nga, affected siya noong experience noong na-interview niya. So halos di ko matapos yung story kasi iyak ako ng iyak dahil doon sa ikinikwento ko. Yung mga narratives ng mga survivors, tapos na-realize ko na, wala pa akong contact sa parents ko. So pinagsama-sama yung na-realize nila yung travels, yung suffering, yung nakausap nila as new subjects. And then sila mismo nandun yung fear. So the balancing act was a struggle as mentioned by one editor who said, lahat naman ng journalists, syempre as individuals, may kanya-kanyang pinagdaraanan na personal. I think yung pag-merge na mga yon, yung pagbalanse nun, I think was most challenging. Tapos according to one Manila-based print reporter, parang harassment na. Wala kang katahimikan sa buhay. At saka yung work-life balance, affected yung work-life balance. Parang di na siya nag-i-exist. Ganun pala pag nagpuyat ka. Ayan. And then many of the respondents also feared going down with COVID-19 as they monitored the rising number of cases, and with more and more people they knew getting afflicted. So yung habang lumalapit dun sa mga sa circle nila, yung mga nakakasakit, nakakadagdag yun sa concerns nila. So sabi ng isang nakausap namin, feeling ko sometimes slow na ako, nagahang na. Ayan. Said a veteran reporter who currently works for an international news organization and who actually got sick with COVID-19. And then yung third, yung fear of failure. So kahit nandun yung challenges, yung blurring of lines between the personal and the professional, nandun pa rin yung sense of purpose as somehow reflected with this fear of failure. So despite the personal and professional struggles, a common denominator among the respondents was the fear of failing to perform their job as journalists. The fear, they said, was evident especially early on when access to more reliable sources was limited and there weren't many opportunities to validate information coming from the government. So in short, baka sila nagiging party to misinformation or even disinformation. Dahil limited yung access to information, baka sila mismo yung nagiging instrumento para sa pagpapakalat ng maling impormasyon na alam nilang merong direktang epekto doon sa mga tao. So said the veteran journalist, I think yun ang biggest challenge natin, how to get more accurate information from health experts and from the government. Yun ang isa sa mga biggest challenges natin. And then ito, how did the journalists see their role during the COVID-19 pandemic. So dito, bumalik yung provider of accurate information and provider of context. So dito, the challenges posed by the pandemic made the role of journalists even clearer. Sorry. The challenges posed by the pandemic made the role of journalists even clearer, as can be gleaned from the responses of the study. Most of them spoke of their primary role of providing accurate information to the public, knowing that any mistake, whether intended or unintended, could have direct and serious effects on ordinary news consumers. So dito bumalik sa pinaka-basic talaga. Dapat accurate yung information na binibigay. And then, aside from accuracy, dito pala muna, may isang quote dito. Walang room on journalism sa unverified information, sa hearsay. Dapat ang ating reporting ay nakabase sa facts at saka data na trusted data from experts and from reliable sources of information. Primary sources of information, according to a veteran journalist who used to work for a war agency. Tapos hindi nagtatapos doon sa provision of accurate information. Aside from accuracy, context is also important. According to a newspaper editor, importante yung pag-humanize ng issues to better explain them both to ordinary Filipinos and policymakers. Ito yung sinite niya example. Hindi lang reportage of facts and figures, but we have to put stories in context for our readers to better understand the issues, humanize the issues, like you have a jeepney driver or jeepney drivers who have not gone back to driving or passengers who have not gone back to work because of restrictions. So for example, aside from figures na pinag-uusapan araw-araw na tumataas, nandun daw yung effort dapat on how to explain these figures further. Tapos for example, policy pronouncement o bawal mo na lumabas yung mga jeepney drivers. Instead of just reporting on that pronouncement by the government, bumababa sila sa field, sa kalye, tinitingnan kung gaano pa katinding epekto ng ganung policy pronouncement doon sa mga jeepney drivers. And the intended audience or audiences are very specific. Yung ordinary Filipinos and at the same time, yung mga nagpapatupad ng polisiya. Ayun. An editor of a news website put it this way, yung role natin na to help people make sense of all the problems we are facing and to shine the light on disinformation and make their lives a bit lighter. Ayan. So at this point, we go to the conclusions. Ito yung mga conclusions na madodraw out natin dun sa pag-aaral na ginawa namin. So number one, during the pandemic, the Philippines was confronted with issues of unpreparedness on the part of the government, corruption, and misinformation and disinformation. Now, given restrictions to access, journalists were quick to adapt to the situation and adopt mechanisms to gather and validate information, such as yung binanggit kanina ni Professor Ipe, verification dashboards, vertical and horizontal verification, virtual lines of communication, and ascribing levels of trustworthiness. Yung kanina pinaliwanag niya yung vertical at saka yung horizontal verification. So pag mayroong pronouncement from the top, let's say IATF, there was an effort to validate it on the ground. Sometimes ginagawa rin yung horizontal verification. Yung sinabi ng isang trusted expert source, binavalidate din sa isa pang trusted expert source. And then misinformation and disinformation also pose bigger challenges to journalists who acknowledge that any wrong information they might inadvertently spread could have serious consequences to people during the pandemic. Now, to avoid this, newsrooms had to allocate more resources to gather only credible information in the face of misinformation and disinformation. Now, this also meant additional workload, especially for smaller newsrooms, which were already struggling with limited human and financial resources even before the pandemic. And then the pandemic lockdowns also forced journalists to log longer hours, sometimes working as long as 18 hours and often blurring the lines between personal and professional time since they were staying at home. Now, this setup led to mental health concerns driven largely by uncertainty as to when the pandemic would end, and with more and more people they knew getting sick. Thus the question, am I or a loved one going to be next? But despite the challenges posed by the pandemic, both to their professional and personal lives, and consistent with related studies, journalists interviewed went back to their moral obligation and sense of purpose, especially in the pandemic. In basic, to tell the truth by providing accurate information and context and minimize harm to a suffering public. Ayan. Maraming salamat po, and We're looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you, everyone, for making time to listen to our presentation.
Thank you, Professor Salvosa, and to Professor Esguerra. Maraming salamat. Siguro at this point, we will introduce first our panel of reactors. We have three community journalists who also experience how to report and how to pivot during the pandemic. And they'll also be sharing their own experiences, kung paano po sila nag-adjust. Hindi ko lang sure, Prof, kung yung iba dito ay naging interviewees nyo din. Kasama ba? I think Rides is part of the...
Newly.
I will neither confirm nor deny that.
Okay. Of course. Because of the... Thank you for that. Okay. So we have
Friend naman
from...
natin free rides.
We have from
yes ba?
Miss Rides Barsha, and then from Visayas, we have Joseph Bernard Marsan, and of course from we will start with Rides. Since I mentioned your name first, good afternoon, Rides.
Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I should share.
Ako ba o si Rides naghang?
Si Rides yata. Oo.
Sige, we
Frozen.
will wait a bit na bumalik si Rides. Napaka-rich nung qualitative part ng study ninyo. Professor Esguerra and Professor Salvosa, parang kasi nung first 7 months we were all talking about percentages, ilan yung
Quantitative.
quantitative eh. Tapos ngayon, even without the names, because you're required not to divulge the names of your interviewees. But it was very, very rich yung discussion kanina.
Tsaka it's also very interesting, Joyce, to look at the results of other countries kasi I thought that there are shared experiences amongst journalists globally, di ba? So we're not just looking at the Philippine experience, but also siguro pag meron na ding results from other countries, putting them together, syempre iba din mga research teams doon, babanggain, di ba? Parang ganun. And look at the global perspective and, in terms of the results, etc. Ayun. So in the span of, let's say, we're looking at the period of the pandemic for these experiences, di ba? Kasi yung conditions naman na binanggit nila kanina, those were already situations even before pandemic, and they were more made pronounced during the pandemic. So parang moving forward also, we're looking at paano maka-counter or not resolve, but what do you call this? Magpa-provide ng solutions, practical solutions to some of the problems already na andyan na pre-pandemic, di ba? So tingnan natin, Joyce, kung andyan na si Rice, kung wala pa, let's move on to the next panelist.
Then we will move first to Joseph Marsan. Hi, Joseph. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, Ma'am Rides, Sir Ariel, Prof. Ipe, and Sir Christian. First off, siguro, ang reaction ko lang siguro dito sa study nila is that very relatable for community journalists, especially dun sa part na combating misinformation and disinformation. Siguro, based on, disclose ko na lang na hindi ako part ng interviewees, no? Pero siguro on the local level, yung naging mahirap na part was that, and until today, is actually a really difficult part of of reporting on health situations, is that yung medyo yung mga health authorities, particularly dito sa Region 6, the Department of Health here in Western Visayas still has to ask clearance from Manila before they can release information. And with the recent monkeypox case, it took more than a day to confirm, kahit alam na ng marami, and other media outlets already reported na nandito yung case. So siguro yung timeliness ng information really causes panic among the people. And kami naman hindi namin nire-report, kahit ni-report na nung iba naming makasama, hindi namin ma-report kasi we have no way of confirming from the authorities themselves. Nung COVID naman, actually, yun din yung naging problema talaga nung nagkaroon ng mga first few cases dito. Medyo nahirapan kaming mag-confirm. Ako, nakakuha na ako ng mga informations from old friends, old classmates, pati mga kapitbahay tungkol dun sa mga cases. And hindi namin siya ma-verify kasi medyo matagal yung pag-deliver ng information sa amin. So kung matagal yung delivery ng information sa amin, what more doon sa sa audiences namin. Given na yung sa amin talaga sa Daily Guardian, actually nag-increase yung readership namin sa social media because of the news that we put out. So yun yung experience siguro na ma-share ko. And at the same time, ako personally, I consider myself a pandemic journalist kasi nung pandemic talaga ako na-hire. The same day that the President Duterte declared a state of calamity based on state of calamity because of COVID-19 was my day zero, and declaring an ECQ in Iloilo City was basically my first day on the job. So talagang ako talagang hindi ko compare yung experience pre-pandemic to the pandemic itself. So talagang yung naging bulk ng reporting ko, yung bulk na reporting namin dito sa Iloilo would be more on COVID from that would be the way from between March 2020 and October 2021 siguro nung how do you say this in Tagalog? medyo nag-ease na yung nag-ease na yung situation. Siguro I'm also reading yung mga comments dito sa Zoom. Yung mental health issues na na-answer ng newsrooms. Siguro local newsrooms, admittedly local newsrooms have less capabilities rather as compared to national newsrooms, no. For us, it also goes to the economics of it. For us, and this is something that I've always mentioned every time tinatanong kami kung kamusta kami sa and maybe baka mga students din to ni Sir Epe and Sir Christian kasi I do remember having two groups from UST asking me about this. We had to stop printing from March to May, and yung paper namin from 18 pages we cut to 12 pages, so that's around siguro mga two sheets ng paper. And talagang naging mahirap yun para sa amin. Kahit hindi ako directly na-apektado kasi nakakatanga pa rin ako ng sweldo, naging mahirap yun para dun sa people who deliver the papers, who print the papers. And dito kasi highly dependent pa rin sa mga newspapers, especially sa mga cafes and libraries and other places kung saan madalas magbasa ng newspaper. So ayun, yun yung naging epekto noon sa amin. Siguro yun lang yung ma-share ko. Medyo marami na akong na-share dito sa regarding being a journalist in the pandemic. So let's discuss more siguro later kapag nagkaroon pa tayo ng further discussions on this. Thank you po.
Thank you, Joseph. Is rides back na? Parang wala pa.
Wala pa po, ma'am.
Oo. Then we will call Miss Julie Alipala. Hi, Julie. Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon. Buenas tardes, maayong hapon. Yeah, yung kanina kasi nung pinisent ni Ipe at saka ni Christian yung kanilang output. Para kasi siyang nag-walkthrough sa akin ulit back to the March 2020, yung simula ng lockdown. Siguro nung past few months lang naman talaga kami nagkaroon ng total lockdown, yung talaga hindi ka makalabas. Pero after 3 months, lumuwag, not necessarily for the whole population of Zamboanga City, but for tawag dito sa mga frontliners, and the journalists are among the frontliners that were provided with a big ID, huge ID na parang isang kalaking notebook. So yun yung parang ticket namin to go out and cover. Meron mga portion doon na I see the yung paano pag-sway ng ating mga journalists to shift to online coverage. Pero in Zamboanga City, hindi namin tawag dito, I don't know how to describe it, pero hindi kami nakasabay sa mga ganong klaseng form of news coverage. Na in person pa rin kami. We go out, we get the stories from the communities, from the doctors, from the funeraria, from the hospital, cementerio, yun, yung mga ganon. Merong mga ilang sigurong mga kasama namin, especially at the time na open pa yung ABS-CBN, where they go, they followed the instruction from their higher office to report from their homes. Pero katagalan naman talaga, hindi mo rin maiwasan na you try to join the other groups kasi nga like the City Hall has already imposed yung virtual press briefing, so they don't no longer allow a journalist to go inside the City Hall to interview health officials, to interview the local chief executive. So yung paraan na ginagawa nila, they just let you submit questions, and then sila na yung paano nila ayusin yung question mo, or paano nila bawasan kung medyo sharp yung mga tanong mo, yung mga ganong sistema. So usually makikita natin na may effort to censor some of the questions, and they just try to give you information na tingin nila would really be for yung sa confined communities na nangangailangan ng information. So maraming disinformation, misinformation na nangyari during that time. In fact, I remember several radio stations na halos, because we are really caught flat-footed at that time, maraming mga information that they get it from social media and they run it on their radio station, and people got afraid. So there are some colleagues here na talagang naging contributory sa mga disinformation, panic, and to the point na nagkaroon din ng yung ubusan ng mga laman ng mga grocery at that time. Pero when it comes to work, habang ang ibang kasama namin ay nagre-report sa loob ng kanilang kwarto, kusina, casillas, or whatever, no? We are doing our work sa field. Kasi ang fear kasi namin dito that time, virtual na lahat eh. So where do we get our information kung virtual na lahat na nakakakita, lahat na nakakabasa, lahat na nakaka-secure ng information? So paano pa namin i-frame ang story kung lahat, even Manila and even outside the country, is already getting the same facts? So we have to go down. We have to get our own stories from the people and let the people speak about their situation. So doon kami nakakabawi ng kahit papano when it comes to our stories. And And in some cases naman, when may mga kasama kami na nagkakasakit, we also discovered na even the newsrooms, even the management, hindi rin talaga handa sa pag-provide ng medical and other necessary gamit, even the PPEs and other vitamins or food for mga kasama namin nagkakasakit. Walang ganung kahandaan din. And may nagtanong kanina ko yung mental health issues. Actually, the mental health issues, hindi naman siya talaga na-handle. We deal it among ourselves. We talk, we see each other, we talk about it. And definitely, we try to make sure na kami ay safe. Hindi kami galing sa isang coverage na medyo sensitive yung pinagkukunan namin ng information. May paranoia of infection pa rin kahit paano, even if we go out. And definitely, aside from fear of losing our jobs, meron din kaming fear of failure to provide information to the people, lalo na kung ang mga sources namin ay pare-pareho lang. And like doon sa mga areas na hindi namin halos ma-reach out, like sa farm areas na may mababang inoculation rate, yung mga health officials doon hindi masyadong, I know they have the data but they refuse to provide talaga the actual data, including even at that time in Zamboanga City where journalists were banned from covering the arrivals of vaccines by the DOH. So may mga ganong situations at that time. And come to think of it, we are still in we are still in the pandemic situation, maybe phasing out na, pero yung situation ng pagbibigay ng information, while the rest, I can still see that they're still covering from their homes. Kami, wala kaming pahinga. So nahihirapan na nga kami kung ano ba talaga nangyari or may COVID ba nangyari. And in some radio stations, they're still questioning, may COVID ba na dumaan sa atin nung panahon na yan. So I'm sure maraming mga kasama natin, especially in Zamboanga City, would also share the same situations like the rest na nagpo-cover ng in-person. Yan. Saka yun sa validation, yung verification dashboard, maganda rin talaga siyang tingnan do kasi kahit sabihin natin may mga virtual pressers na binababa ang mga authorities, ang mga health officials, we also, ito din yung napansin namin na yung heavy use on social media, saka yun sa mga website ng established health officials. Unlike before na makikita natin, in fact, I met one from the Department of Health na talagang before the pandemic, halos iniikutan lang ng, parang dinadaanan na ang kanilang website, except lang kung may mga malalaking cases. Pero this time, talagang yung kanilang website talagang bumibigat because of the heavy use. Yeah. And visit. So far yun lang yung nakita kong siguro kakaiba lang talaga doon sa presentation, but sa amin lang talaga, hindi namin makita yung work from home and in person kasi except siguro sa mga family members natin na laging nasa bahay and the bata, pero we do our work still by field coverage. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. And Joseph earlier, balikan na lang natin si Rides pag nakakonect na siya later on sa atin. And then we will now start our open forum. Ariel, we have lots of questions from our participants. We have over 200 na sa ating Zoom room right now. Siguro simulan ko lang kay Prof. Salvosa and Prof. Esguera. Ako personally, ang question ko ay, itong pandemic also gave birth to think tanks. foremost of which is Okta Research. Parang ang question ko lang, paano nangyari yon na parang we gave them that kind of credibility, or we just
Legitimacy.
accepted the way they paano nila himayin yung data on COVID? Was it because hindi natin magawa on our own? And then eventually you would see ABS-CBN also doing it, sina Guido, yung research team nila, GMA. Pero yun, curious lang ako kasi parang ang bilis. Paglabas ng Okta Research, parang we just accepted na, okay, they're experts on this. Well, they're not experts on the pandemic, they're experts on data, pero biglang we're quoting them left and right.
Ako muna sasagot, Joyce.
Oo.
I leave it to Christian to
May ako dyan eh. Ito syempre hindi naman to purely covered ng nung study namin. Pero kasama, a big part of this also is driven by observation. Tama yung sabi ni Joyce no? Parang bakit nagkaroon instant credibility yung yung Okta Research Group na heavily quoted sila, especially early on. I think yung reason dun obvious kasi everyone was grappling for expert opinions outside of the DOH. Para naghahanap tayo lahat ng counterbalance. And it happened na merong isang grupo na made itself very prominent. Tapos diba later on nagkaroon ng UP Pandemic Response Team. So meron ding statistician na kino-quote na from UP. But everyone was basically caught off guard So wala tayong mga data analysts from our newsrooms right away, no? And then eventually we realized na kailangan pala magkaroon nun para magkaroon independent analysis. Pero again, based on data coming from the Department of Health. So yung Okta, naging instant counterbalance dun sa data coming from the DOH. Tapos kung napansin niyo sa DOH early on sa website nila, nakatago yung tinanong ko to before sa DOH bakit yung presentation niya ng infographics medyo nakatago ng konti, mas maliit yung yung font noong mas marami nakakasakit araw-araw. Parang sabi nila, hindi yata sinasadya. So, pero immediately kung journalist ka, para magkakaroon ka ng instant suspicion. So yun, pero later on, di ba, even the Okta Research Group was also taken to task na tinatanong, teka, ano bang credibility nyo? Kasi minsan, di ba, napansin natin as journalists covering the pandemic, parang may ibang members or ilang experts lumalabas na rin sa areas of expertise nila. So for example, statistician ka, pinag-uusapan mo ng dapat numbers, pero nag-a-advise na on how to properly implement the lockdowns, ano yung mga pwedeng gawin to prevent infection. Kahit yung iba rin conventional wisdom, parang nagkakaroon tayo ng one-stop shop o 7-Eleven type of expert source na pag nagsalita yung isang statistician, lahat na gusto nating malaman pati medical sa kanya na nanggagaling. So ako personally, na-realize ko yan na napapansin ko bakit itong pinapakinggan ko, ayoko na mag-name names, no? Pero bakit siya mismo, parang naging doktor na rin sa pagbibigay ng, ng advice. So.
Actually, kaya lang na-trigger din naman yan sa akin kasi pagdating ng election, but they're also being quoted. Parang, teka muna, bakit ganon? Tama kaya, parang one-stop shop for everything. Expert of all, na sila, no? Every
Joyce,
topic.
Joyce,
yes, Prof.
Si Father Nicanor Austriaco, I think is a very good case study. So, nagkaroon din siya ng ascribed credibility, but he has added value because he's a man of the cloth.
Yeah.
So, they used Father Austriaco to convince the higher ecclesiastical authorities, in other words, CBCP members, no, to embrace yung vaccines, no, kasi nga masyadong talamak yung vaccine hesitancy among some segments of the population. Apart from that, he has a background in I think microbiology, if I'm not mistaken.
No, microbiology from MIT.
Yeah.
And then he had an Ivy League degree. Tapos meron siya, he holds a professorship, and he has his own biology laboratory in the United States. No, so he ticks all the boxes as far as source credibility, reliability, expertise is concerned.
And he was actually sitting in the meetings. He was being consulted.
Right. Ayun, thank you. Thank you for that, Christian and Ipe. May mga questions tayo from our participants, Sorry, yung isa dito, with the age of social media, people have easy access to a medium that can report real-time news. Was there anything on your research that revealed something about citizen journalism?
Hindi siya natanong hindi siya covered
The focus was really on...
We can discuss this dito sa forum, pero technically, hindi siya covered ng research.
Okay. Joyce, merong siguro related into, but this was also mentioned in the research. Why was the journalist struggle? Why was the journalist struggle with the shrinking space of press freedom and limited access to basic information? Are you being threatened in terms of your physical and mental health?
Sagot ako, Ipe.
That was the answer. Yeah. And also the panelists can answer this actually.
Dun sa area kasi ng mental health concerns, lumabas din kasi yung self-doubt, 'di ba? Kaya nilagay namin doon sa fear of failure. Merong ganung theme na lumabas na parang dinadoubt nila na ito bang ginagawa ko mas nakakatulong ba o baka naman mas nakakasama doon sa sa problema. Kasi 'di ba before ang mindset ng mga journalists, pag nag-report ka, may epekto sa tao pero hindi mo naman siya agad nakikita. Pero dito, meron agad epekto. For example, nagkamali ka ng report na pwede na pala lumabas kasi niluwagan na yung lockdown. Pag lumabas yung tao, magkakasakit, 'di ba? So nakikita natin immediately epekto nung misinformation. Na ibig sabihin hindi natin sinasadyang pagpapakalat ng information. So doon pumapasok 'yun, yung initially merong self-doubt Tsaka 'di ba, iba takot sa numbers kaya very careful in terms of reporting data about the pandemic.
Prof. Ipe, you want to add to it? Or Julie or Joseph?
Maybe Julie or Joseph.
Kasi meron tanong din related to that. I don't know if you asked this question sa mga interviews niyo. How is the mental health issues answered by newsrooms in the course of the interviews? Hindi tinanong. Oo. Kasi I was also thinking that alam na kung ano nangyari during the pandemic. And as I said, alam na din even before the pandemic, there were already problems unanswered, walang solusyon. But nag-recalibrate na yung newsrooms ngayon. In fact, some of them, baka meron ng mechanisms na nilagay dun sa mga newsrooms para not exactly insulate journalists from any harm, but I think to respond to situations like crisis, whether health or emergencies. So, meron bang lumabas na ganun, Christian or Ipe, na meron na silang mga mechanisms in their newsrooms?
Hindi masyadong napunta sa mechanisms yung daloy ng interview, no? But definitely this issue was flagged by our interviewees as a major issue, no? And based on our review of the transcripts, and the implications of this is very clear. Implications are very clear. One of the things that newsrooms need to look at is the workload, no, the daily workload on journalists, no. So I think prior to the lockdown, marami na storya sinusulat ng mga reporters, no. And I would say mas marami ngayong pandemic because I would say newsrooms are even compensating for the lack of face-to-face or in-person coverage, no, by simply assigning all sorts of webinars to their reporters, no, and the reporters felt obliged or compelled to write the stories on these webinars kahit na hindi naman talaga newsworthy. So I think the implications on newsroom policy are clear. Now we have to look at the kind of workload we give to our journalists.
Kasi dagdag ko lang, no, kasi I remember ibang mga transcripts na nireview namin. May mga interviewees na nagsabi, mas naging lenient yung newsroom doon sa sa reporters kasi understandably limited yung resources tapos they were working longer hours. So mas hindi sila yung yung 'di ba ordinarily iba mga newsrooms dati, hindi basta magtrabaho ka, 'di ba, bahala ka sa buhay mo.
Oo.
Pinasok mo 'yan. Eto mas mas naging lenient yung ibang newsrooms daw, sabi nila. Tapos yung isa naman, I remember ito, editor to, sinasabi niya early on talaga nag-invest sa nagkaroon additional na gastos yung newsroom kasi they had to rearrange the newsroom. Tapos mas marami yung nandun sa labas, 'di ba? Nasa bahay nila. Tapos very very strict yung rule daw. Bawal kayo mag-cover pa until we said na pwede na kayo lumabas. Oh.
Yeah. Wow, leniency. Okay, sorry. Tita Jules, ikaw muna. Yeah.
Gusto ko lang kasi malaman na may ginawa na bang content analysis like from the early like mid of 2020 to at the end of that 2020 dito sa mga papers kasi as far as I can see sa online mas heavy siya sa mga ang tawag dito yung mga press releases na medyo inayos lang ng konti. Dinagdagan lang siguro ng konting ng sources. Pero if you look at it, I don't know, I just look at 3 dailies, national dailies, and halos may kapare-pareho. So parang every kinakain nila yung mga pinoprovide na information sa kanila, and that's also one thing na kami mismo dito sa local na we talk about. Teka nga, like for example, we have one from the Philippine Star na pag-usapan na teka baka ako mawawala na ng trabaho nito kasi the information coming from the different areas, from the different regions, pumapasok pa rin sa newsroom, and that also prompted him to become a correspondent now when he was a regular before with the Philippine Star. So ito yung mga issues na also, yun yung medyo yung fear na, yung sinasabi ko ng apprehension at that time. That's why we have to go out and get the story. Even me, I also felt that way kasi marami nang nagre-resign, nagre-retire sa Philippine Daily Inquirer, and I was also thinking na if our newsroom would be dependent heavily on the provided information coming from the different agencies, from the LGU, what else to report? So we have to go out and we have to do something about it and to provide context from the local, from the community, and to give a little bit more image or face to the story, what the national paper, what the national agencies are feeding to the people who are writing their stories at home.
Siguro balikan ko lang yung tanong kanina, no? While it was not really discussed in the study, may comment kasi si Ms. Weng Paraan dito. Sabi niya, social media has become a major source of information. Some of the reports were actually citizen journalist reports. Others were posts that needed context and verification. Lumabas din ba yon in terms of sourcing na mas pumaling sila sa online sources maliban sa official sources?
Hindi, lumabas doon sa naging one of the sources yung mga tao naturally. Pero yung kanina, yung pinakita namin sa teams, ito yung naman, yung nagbabangga yung official at saka another expert source. Pero naturally, ito yung isang editor na binanggit namin kanina, yung sabi niya, the importance of humanizing the story.
Yeah.
Especially early on, binabanggit niya doon na syempre hindi makalabas, di ba? So they had to look at the accounts of people on the ground on how the policies were affecting them. Sige.
Actually, when it comes to social media, we found na there were 2 major uses of social media in pandemic reporting. But ang lumabas sa result namin, it became more of distribution, a distribution platform. And in some of the interviewees, we found that there was some level of distrust on social media. No, so of course, if you're good at validation, verification, of course there were a lot of good cases of journalists, getting leads, very good leads from social media. But we also detected a certain level of distrust pagdating sa social media because yun nga, you still need to verify, seek the permission, ayaw mong ma-viral, etc. na hindi ka nagpaalam, kinuha mo yung image or video, things like that. No?
Oo nga. Thanks,
Yeah.
Professor Ipe.
Joyce, babalikan ko yung binanggit ni Christian kanina because we all know that everyone adjusted to the pandemic, to the situation. Even newsrooms evolved also at this point, diba? So, yung binanggit ni Christian kanina, leniency, did it affect or does it affect the quality of reportage during the pandemic?
Sorry, yung leniency? Na
nag-adjust yung mga yung
parang mas lenient.
Okay. Yung mga newsrooms yung naging lenient.
Oo.
Hindi, kaso we cannot answer that based on the study kasi that would require another set of interviews at saka content analysis. So yung kayo binabanggit ni Julie, importante nga yun. No? Siguro next round of studies yung iba baka gustong gumawa ng content analysis. Especially early on, yung parang pinaparot na lang yung yung official sources. Not because we wanted to, but because that was reality.
We have 3 sections of journalism seniors doing their thesis here. Probably they could undertake content analysis now, taking the lead from Julie.
So Joyce, I'm reading some of the questions. Some are not related to the study, but just the same, some can be asked with answers from personal katulad nito. We all know that this pandemic has really caused hardships to every Filipino. Journalists are one of them, of course. So my question daw niya is, despite all the hardship this pandemic gave us, what do you think or how do you think this pandemic helps every journalist, according to them, to become a better journalist or to improve in their profession?
I think if you went through this pandemic, this was a very eye-opening experience for many. No, if you heard Bernard Marsan's sharing kanina, no, pandemic harsha, no, and one editor told us, no, they were forced to become science reporters overnight. No, di ba, Christian? No, because they were so used to reporting on politics, no, and other, for example, defense security issues, and all of a sudden you'll be talking about vaccines, replication rate, etc. No, so many journalists were forced to learn, no, things about epidemiology, about viruses, about vaccines. And I think many of them came out to become better journalists, having exposed to more complicated stories and having to be more creative in reaching out to sources. No, I think one thing that I can say is that journalists really try their best, no, not to sacrifice standards. No, the very fact that they develop these verification routines, no, itong mga source vetting routines, no, is an effort to ensure that reporting standards do not suffer because of this pandemic.
Ara, that is an answer to your question. Was there any privilege or anything positive for journalists during the pandemic? Ayun, sinagot na ni Prof. Ipe. Joyce?
May interesting question dito, although again, no, maybe not discussed in the study. Sabi dito ni Archie, hold on Andre Marasigan. Since journalists have been combating disinformation or propaganda from all sides while scouring for the truth, how do they at the same time also combat the rise of right-wing media during these tumultuous times? Prof. Ipe or Prof. Christian?
I think I have a short response to that. I think everyone was subjected to verification and fact-checking. Lahat, journalists try their best to fact-check everyone, including, of course, there's a presumption na, okay, government to, they're supposed to give us truthful information, and yet government still needed to be verified. No, so the same thing would be true for the others. No, so yung sinasabi ng right-wing media, siguro umuusbong siya, pero who will confer credibility to that? No, mga journalists din. So kung hindi siya, it's not being taken seriously, then hindi siya, it won't gain traction, I would say.
Dagdag ko lang, ito lang nakakatakot na naalala ko rin doon sa ivermectin debate, no? The fact na nagkaroon pa ng furious debate as to whether that could be actually useful against COVID-19. Ang isang alarming na na-realize ko doon, wala naman to sa study, no? Pero based on my observation experience in time na yun, there were even people among us promoting that ivermectin. Diba? Kaya napapansin nyo nagkakaroon ng ng platform, yung ibang mga ivermectin promoters, even on TV. So, yun ang nakakatakot kasi tayo nasa front lines dapat ng verification eh. Kaya I think that could also be the subject of another conversation, yung false balance na hindi nare-realize ng iba sa atin, na nakita natin doon sa ivermectin debate. Parang sinasabi, kausapin naman natin ito nagpo-promote na ivermectin. Pero ang nangyayari, nilalatag lang yung plataforma sa kanya. Tapos, quote-unquote na mga questionable science sources, pero debunk pala. O kaya very intellectually dishonest yung metadata na pinapakita, di ba? Kaya, kasi pala, deep inside, yung nag-i-interview, naniniwala doon sa ivermectin.
Tsaka makita mo na okay, lumalabas tong mga sources na to na pro-ivermectin sa isang programa sa radyo, teleradyo or whatever. Pero ika-counteract
Ako, ba't ganun?
ng ibang mga
mag-ANC pa yan, ha?
No? Ika-counteract yan ng ibang mga news websites, no? Yung mga ibang mga nagfa-fact check on ivermectin. No? So, I think that's the beauty of our system. No, maraming media entities, no, so everyone is subject to verification and fact checking, and diba?
May question dito sa chat at may full disclosure siya ay si Jenny Tamano, PIO ng Provincial Government of Lanao del Sur. Ang question niya, helpful daw ba ang government information officers during the pandemic in terms of information dissemination as well as gathering of data?
Pasasagutin ko dyan si Miss Julie. Pero dun sa interviews namin, lumabas doon na also part of the routines of journalists is to only get information from verified accounts of government agencies and government offices. No, kasi ibig sabihin yan, more or less validated, okay, yan talagang government office na yan na nagpapatakbo ng Facebook account na yan. Kung walang verified badge, then subject to more verification, subject to more vetting. So to the extent that the government offices obtained their verified badges or exerted efforts to project an image na this Facebook page is trustworthy, I think nakatulong sila sa pandemic coverage.
Okay. Christian, you want to add to that?
Hindi, okay na ako. Pakinggan natin sila Julie. Maganda yan eh.
Julie.
Yeah. In a way, helpful naman talaga yung mga government information officers. Pero syempre dumadaan pa rin talaga sila sa mga lines, layers before they release the information. Like for example, kahit mismo sila at in the first few months, hindi nila alam paano i-categorize yung mga nagkakasakit. So they have to refer us to the city health officer, to the health department, to the barangay health station, kung sino mga in charge. Kasi hindi rin nila talaga alam kung paano siya i-qualify ang isang tao or tumaas yung cases sa isang area. So and at the same time, sila din naman yung nagpo-process ng mga questions namin, especially the government information officers. So tinitignan nila kung ano yung mga critical questions na teka, wag muna natin to ibigay kay mayor or kay city health official o dun sa kasi naging epicenter namin yung jail for COVID, because there were several jail officers who went to Davao and came naglaro ata sa Derby and came home, brought this pandemic and nagkalat, dumami. Kaya yung aming BJMP at that time talagang naging sila, under fire sila for that.
the point is hindi namin kaagad makuha yung information from the government information officer. So ang haba ng proseso na dinadaanan. And pero regular naman sila nagpo-provide ng information, like every day they issue statements sa social media. They no longer call the journalists, they will just notify you that they release a statement. Parang ganun. Yung nga pala sa ivermectin in Zamboanga City, naging issue din niya kasi mismo ang mga station, may mga, I think, three radio stations at that time promoting ivermectin kasi their station is also selling that their siguro the managers told their reporters or anchor to promote ivermectin because they're also selling that, and in fact one of the former presidents of a university even endorsed that kasi she heard it from one of the radio station na it was really effective. So parang may ganung issue na parang disturbing siya at the same time because it came from radio stations na maraming nakikinig, especially in Zamboanga City.
Maybe si Joseph would like to share his thoughts.
Siguro nag-catch din ang attention ko yung sinabi ni Ma'am Julie kanina regarding dun sa sa information siguro yung naging isa sa mga challenges ng mga LGUs was that they did not have enough information on COVID-19 back then, which ngayon actually parang medyo na-remedyohan na nila kasi parang even before monkeypox came to the Philippines, meron ng mga they already had briefings with their officials, and pati kami sa media nagtatanong na rin kami ng maraming tanong kasi alam namin na if this new disease does not get controlled, we might see it spread similarly to COVID-19. Ganun yung namin. So, ayun, parang na-catch ko rin kanina yung sinabi nila Sir Ipe na overnight na naging science journalists kami. Ako, parang feeling ko nagkaroon ako ng introduction to my journalistic career as a science journalist na kasi I got hired during the pandemic, and almost all of my reporting in 2020 was COVID-19 na lang, and to explain as well kasi parang dun sa mga articles ko rin I also had to take time to explain ano ba yung variants of concern, ano ba yung variants of interest, ano ba yung mga live vaccines, attenuated vaccines. So, hindi kami basta naging science journalists lang. We became science communicators na parang naging teacher kami kung paano mag-explain ng mga bagay-bagay to our audiences. Kasi somehow, while others may think that explaining the concepts, explaining the scientific concepts does not actually matter. It actually really matters, especially to the localities. Kasi dito, unlike sa Manila, mas malakas yung internet connection sa Manila compared sa mga provinces so hindi madali makapick up ng information yung mga tao dito, and mas nagiging prone sila to misinformation and disinformation, basically because yung mga nagiging sources lang nila are social media and traditional forms of media. Dito sa Iloilo, the most popular remains to be the radio stations. Pero minsan din kasi yung mga radio stations hindi rin sila nakakapag-report ng tama. So that's where the local newspapers come in and other media outlets come in. So we have to be able to kind of clarify things with authorities and fact check. Hindi lang basta fact check, but to completely clarify ano ba yung mga concepts, ano ba yung mga dapat malaman ng mga tao. Yun.
Thank you, Joseph. May comment dito si Ares. Mga ganitong comments ni Ares Halimbawa daw yung sinabi ni former President Duterte na sasampalin niya yung virus or maghilamos ng gasolina to disinfect. I-report daw ba natin yon, or kahit na alam natin na it will contribute to disinformation? Ang tawag dyan pagiging oxygen of amplification ka ba? Ano bang dapat gawin? Christian?
Ako, honest opinion ko dyan kasi initially naisip ko deadmahin yan eh. Di ba?
Yeah.
Ang problema, miski i-ignore natin on the part of the legacy media or even yung mga online news organizations, merong consumer yung ganyang kalokohang katarantaduhang detalye, di ba? So we have no choice but to actually correct that and expose the ridiculous nature of that statement. Ganun talaga yan ang nature ngayon ng disinformation.
Yeah. So report but verify, but vet.
Hindi report, talagang i-debunk. Hindi lang i-report.
Okay.
Diretso debunk. I think many journalists were conscious of that. Many Malacanang reporters were consciously doing that kahit sa mga live tweeting nila.
Yeah.
Balikan yung unang point.
Go ahead.
For some big LGUs with media savvy local executives, there was a trend early in the pandemic to bypass the media, no, and go straight to their audiences by conducting once a day or even twice a day broadcasts, no. So nangyari din to sa Amerika, for example, di ba yung dating governor ng New York si Governor Cuomo, no. So ginawa din niya ni Isko Moreno. So para siyang newscaster, may lower third siya, may graphics siya, may statistics, no? Ganon din maging. And many other LGUs, big and small, basta media savvy yung mayor or governor, meron silang parang mga nightly newscast, and the obvious intention or objective is to bypass the mainstream and go directly to their constituents.
At nung maraming negative comments,
to serve a purpose na yung mga hindi makapag-cover o hindi makapag-interview dahil walang access, yun rin ang kino-quote yung mga broadcast ng mga LGU executives.
Anong negative impact nun?
Kontrolado nila yung narrative.
Kontrolado nila yung narrative, yeah. And that means you will have to expend effort to debunk that narrative if anything needs to be debunked.
Parang example lang, si Julie gusto sumagot. Pero ito example lang, kunwari sinabi nung local official, dito, gumagana yung ivermectin, bili na kayo, okay yan. Kung walang access for question on the part of the media, o kaya dadaan lang tayo sa mga chat questions, di pwedeng ignore, di ba? So mahirap pantayin yung yung sinasabi nun. Kung maraming viewers, maraming followers.
Julie, you wanted to add?
No. Kasi ganun doon sa Zamboanga, yung media sabi yung mayor, and at first it was a virtual press briefing at nauwi na lang siya sa parang she's talking to her audience. Gumawa na rin siya ng ibang schedule for that and giving regular updates. But the point, hindi ka pwedeng mag-ask ng question. So hindi mo pwedeng, like for example, saan napunta yung Bayanihan Fund? Hindi niya sinasagot yan. So you're just facing blank wall until such time umatras din o itinigil dahan-dahan ng mayor because of the negative. Dahan-dahan niya, dinisable na niya yung comment section kasi na overwhelmed sa mga negative comments against her. And in the end, tumigil na rin siya with her virtual talking during the pandemic with her constituents, yung ganon. Marami kang they give you the schedule, and ang problema kasi you have to wait. Parang sinasabay niya din kung ano yung schedule ni Duterte. After Duterte, dapat sila na yung papasok. So parang they have to explain to the people from what Duterte issued, like whatever. No, I don't call it policy, pero definitely they bring it down, and every weekly or twice a month, nagbibigay din sila ng another virtual talking to their audience pag may downgrading of mga protocols and restrictions. So parang nakakapagod na siya to the point yung mga tao mismo nauumay na sila sa ganung klaseng exchanges. So they want to look for other stories, for other issues, for other activities in the community. So I think they also realize that. So yun, it's just a one way. Wala kang way of to
to get back or to get her reaction.
Yeah.
So parang ganun lang. So talk ka lang, wala na. Yun.
I just want to read parts of what Ride sent sa Facebook Messenger, ano? Kasi medyo pangit talaga yung internet connection niya now. She said, this is her reaction. Media broke the wall of silence regarding the COVID outbreak. Without members of the Fourth Estate, misinformation will continue on social media. And sadly, government is part of the disinformation through its own trolls. Without correct information from the authorities, coronavirus can kill a lot of people. Politicians use the pandemic as a political propaganda to advance their vested interests in the guise of a community pantry, among others. And then, factual news and accurate news are critical for reporting to educate and inform the public. Saka empirical data must be counter-checked on the ground by journalists, ano? Yeah. So yun ang kanyang reaction. Thank you, Rights, for sending this. Ano, she made an effort to send her reaction kahit hindi siya makakonect. Siguro we'll ask maybe our last two questions before we wrap up. There's one question here from Gail Dagano. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Sabi niya, is it more effective to increase the penalties or have a to penalize disinformation? And I don't know what he meant by this, but invoke a great extent of information verification prior to publishing news. Not part of the study, but your thoughts on this?
Ang unang
Professor
question ko rin sa penalty,
Yeah.
who would penalize a purveyor of disinformation? I suppose government, di ba?
Oh, paano kung sila
Imagine yung climate ngayon. No? Kaya ako hindi ko favor sa ganun. Miski sa in conversations elsewhere sa ibang bansa,
Yeah.
napaka-tricky, napaka-dangerous ng government regulation. Kasi pwedeng gamitin yan, hindi rin sa nagpapakalat ng disinformation kundi doon sa lumalaban sa disinformation.
Correct.
Right.
So yun ang nakakatakot doon. Kunwari sa environment natin ngayon sa Pilipinas, 'di ba? Very in particular, 'di ba? Kine-question nga yung pinaka-meaning ng ano ba yung totoo Tapos ginagaslight yung nagde-debunk ng disinformation. So pag nagkaroon ng ganun legislation, gagamitin against us yun. So counterproductive.
We try to avoid more legislation.
Oo, nakakatakot yun.
At best,
Merong proposal ngayon May isang bill I forgot kung sino nag-file. Si yata. Yung mag-asawang yung Malaban congresswoman, yung asawa niya sa Anwaray. If I remember correctly, meron silang bill. Yan, to penalize fake news.
Oo.
Kakatakot yun.
Yeah.
Prof. Ipe?
Yeah, I agree. Double-edged sword yung regulation of fake news. And first of all, how do you define fake news? Who are you going to punish? Paano kung hindi identifiable? Are you gonna, diba? Are you going to look for IP addresses and look for the specific person who made that post? Hirap nun. And that opens a lot of risks to.
Pero siguro ibang usapan, Prof, kung government official or employee yung nagpapakalat. Oo.
Nagmamanufacture.
Kasi
maybe covered na yun ng
covered na dapat ng
administrative as
yeah.
Okay. May comment lang dito sa chat. Local press cons were very helpful.
Yung iba naman mga question, Joyce, pare-pareho naman related to each other, which already you already asked.
Oo. I think that's more or less that's it from our end sa ating Q&A.
Yeah, tinitingnan pa rin natin baka meron pang gusto humabol, but it's already almost 3 o'clock and we're supposed to end at 3 o'clock, di ba? Kung wala na po, ayun, Joyce, baka may nagtatanong. Well, magtatanong sila. where do they get the full study or the results or
yeah.
findings?
Where do they get
Usap
a
na kami
copy
ni
of the full
of
study?
EPE. We will upload them in the PPI
We'll upload it in the PPI site.
Yeah,
Oh.
the PPI website. So we don't have to email them,
Oo.
each one of them one by one. So doon lang po sa www.fieldpressinstitute.net. Andun po sa under resources, lalagay po namin yung study na ito or results or findings ng second research endeavor ng PPI. Kasi, di ba Joyce, ito yung last year was the start, this is the second, and then the
Yes.
third will be next year, and we salute the research team of Prof. Ipe and Esguera for coming up with a very substantial and very relevant, Joyce, na research na kailangan nating lahat. So what I'm saying is that this study or research is not just limited to media industry, to us as media practitioners, pero sa public din. Kasi nanonood sa atin ngayon, Joyce, hindi naman limited to the academics, hindi lang yung media, pero andun po yung, meron nga kanina binanggit mo from the government, So,
Yes.
ito po yung, yun, si Ares, sa government na si Ares, Ayun. So, wala na pong tanong, All right. Kami po ay nagpapasalamat sa inyong lahat, and we congratulate the whole team. At saka at this point, on behalf of the PPA board and its members nationwide, and also on behalf of Ms. Amalia Cabusao, who could not make it in the opening, I'd like to call our trustee for Luzon, also publisher of an award-winning newspaper in Batangas. Please welcome Mr. Jonald Rayos for his closing remarks. Ayan.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Pasensya na. Na-check ako ng traffic dito sa tabi ng highway.
Ay, nahuli.
Anyway, kinocongratulate natin sa ngalan ng PPI, ng buong PPI, ang ating dalawang sisigasig na mananaliksik, si Sir Ipe at saka si Sir Christian, sa napakagandang trabaho na kanilang ginawa. Ito ay hindi simple, hindi ordinaryo, sapagkat iti tumalakay mismo sa ating mismong mga trabaho. Paano tayo tumugon sa hamon ng pandemya.
Correct.
Sa nakalipas na 2 taon, hindi basta-basta ang ating pakikibaka. Naririyang ang pinakamahirap na punto nito ay ang iyong ibalita ay ang mga kasamahan mo mismo. Mga kasamahan mo mismo na siyang nahihirapang makipaglaban sa COVID. Marami tayong mga kasamahan na nakipaglaban sa pandemyang ito, tinamaan ng sakit, ang iba ay sumakabilang buhay. At ang iba ay patuloy na sumulong upang magpatuloy sa kanilang mga trabaho. Sa likod ng lahat ng mga pagsubok na ating dinaanan, na nakita natin na inilahad sa pagsasaliksik na ito, nakita natin kung gaano kaimportante ang ating trabaho, gaano kaimportante ang ating papel na ginagalawan sa ating komunidad. At ito nga ang hamon sa atin ngayon. Sabi nga, moving forward, pagkatapos ng pandemya o habang tayo ay lumalakad sa pagtatapos ng pandemya, in this new normal, paano tayo magtrabaho? Ang mga hamon na ating kinaharap sa nakalipas na 2 taon, ang siyang lalong magpapatibay sa atin na tayo ay mas maging masigasig sa ating trabaho dahil hindi kailanman mawawala ang ating mga trabaho. Iyan ang ating misyon. Ang tayo ay manatiling tagapaghatid ng totoo, factual at kumpletong impormasyon sa ating mga kababayan. Dahil may mga kababayan tayo na nawawalan na ng pag-asa sa ating pamahalaan. Nawawalan ng pag-asa sa kanila mismo mga komunidad. Pero nagkakaroon sila ng pag-asa kapag sila nakakarinig ng tama at makatotohanang pagbabalita mula sa ating hanay. So iyon po ang hamon sa ating lahat. At tulad ng nabanggit ni na Sir Christian at saka ni Sir Epe, mayroon pang mga, sabi nga, other rooms to dig deeper sa pagsasaliksik na ito. Marami pang bagay na pwede pang saliksikin na mas makakatulong o higit na makakatulong sa ating mismong mga newsroom. Paano tayo gagawa, paano tayo kikilos habang tayo patuloy nakikibaka ngayong hindi pa lubusang nawawala ang pandemya. So sa ngalan po ng buong PPI at saka siyempre ng ating Vice Chairman, Ami Kabusaw, ang aming pong pagbati sa ating dalawang magigiting na mananaliksik. At siyempre sa ating lahat na patuloy na nakikibaka sa ating misyon na ito. Muli, magandang hapon. Maraming salamat.
Wow, very well said, Trustee. Thanks for joining us today. Joyce, tama ba, no? Technically, we're still in a pandemic, right?
Yes.
Yeah, nasa pandemic pa rin tayo. So,
actually, ang gusto ko yung sinabi ni Jonald na itong study ni Prof. Ipe and ni Christian can be a springboard for future studies. Ang dami pa talagang pwedeng himayin at pwedeng tingnan na aspekto ng coverage natin under this new normal.
Yeah, and we're also looking forward to their second research next year, Joyce.
Yes.
It's also going to be the topic of our monthly Scholastic Press Outreach Program. And I was to say about this also poses a challenge to every single newsroom in this country to look at their own mechanisms. Yung pagtibayin, yung...
Ariel, Joyce, nakalimutan ko pala na pasalamatan ng HSF sa patuloy
of course,
ipagtuwang sa atin. Kung wala sila, hindi natin magiging sa katuparan ng maganda itong research na to. Diba?
Yeah.
At saka nakikisuyo tayo sa ating mga participants. All 200 or almost 200 were still with us sa Zoom room. Please accomplish the survey form, the online survey form. Nasa chat po natin yung link nito.
Yeah, we'd like to find out from you kung ano pang pwede namin gawin. Well, for next year already, not this year, pero it really pays a lot to listen to you kasi I'd like to improve on our training programs with HSF and with our other partners. As I said, sana matapos ito at umuwi tayo, umuwi, no? Kahit nasa small boxes tayo, napag-isipan yung mga bagay-bagay na patungkol sa ating trabaho bilang media practitioners or kahit anong profesyon at sa ating industriya kung saan pa tayo pwedeng makatulong, Joyce, sa paglaganap ng tamang impormasyon dahil isa yun sa mga trabaho natin. And I think PPA, not just PPA but as well as other media organizations will continue to be at the helm of fighting disinformation, giving the right training programs and other activities, whether Zoom or in person, para ipagpatuloy yung ating contribution sa ating industry at sa ating society. On that note, I'd like to thank our presenters, our panelists, and to you, our dear participants inside the meeting room and those who are watching us live on Facebook. And thanks to our Seminar Director, Joyce Pañares. Of course, Hans Seidel Foundations, aning training team, Joyce, technical team, sila Kerr, si Ate Bes, si Lisa, sila Rog, sila Priscilla, at ayun na, nabanggit ko. At sa ating board, Joyce, for giving us the blessing also, yung imprimatur sa paggawa ng ganitong activities. On that note, we congratulate everyone and we still see you. Mamaya po yung premiere. I have to plug. Mamaya po, 4 p.m. In all social media platforms ng PPI. Premiere na po yung podcast namin for this month at 4 p.m. And we shall see you in other activities at the end of this month and also at the end of this month, the beginning of this month or next month, September until November. Thanks everyone and see you next time.
Thank you,
that
everyone.
That is our podcast. Yay!